Behind the barbed wire of Camp Crossville, Tennessee, May 1945, a German prisoner did something no American guard expected. He wept when told the war was over. Not tears of relief, tears of terror. Within weeks, 372,000 German POWs held on American soil would face the same paralyzing question: return to a homeland transformed into hell itself, or risk everything to stay in the land of their former enemy. The precise moment arrived at 0847 hours, December 18, 1943, when the transport ship USS Edmund B. Alexander docked at Norfolk Naval Station, Virginia. The temperature hovered at 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Salt spray froze on metal railings. From the cargo holds emerged 847 German prisoners of war, captured weeks earlier during the North African campaign, their boots scraping against American steel for the first time. They expected brutality. They had been conditioned by 12 years of propaganda to anticipate torture, starvation, execution. Goebbels had filled their heads with images of American savagery. Instead, they found military police officers distributing wool blankets and hot coffee in metal cups that burned their frozen fingers. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and profound. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell from Des Moines, Iowa, 32 years old, combat veteran with shrapnel scars across his left shoulder, watched them with practiced assessment. He had seen German efficiency in battle, witnessed their disciplined ferocity. Now he observed something unexpected in their eyes: confusion mixed with cautious relief. "They look like they're waiting for the other shoe to drop," he told Lieutenant Charles Hammond, a former high school principal from Portland, Maine, who served as camp liaison officer. The strategic situation was unprecedented in American military history. By early 1944, the United States held responsibility for 378,000 German prisoners of war scattered across 511 camps in 44 states. The Geneva Convention mandated humane treatment, but America went further, implementing a detention system that would inadvertently create the most unexpected consequence of the war: prisoners who would beg not to go home. Camp Crossville, Tennessee, constructed hastily in Cumberland County farmland, typified the American approach. The facility sprawled across 640 acres, housing 467 German POWs by February 1944. Wooden barracks stood in orderly rows, each containing coal-burning stoves against Appalachian winter cold. Prisoners received the same daily food ration as American troops: 4,000 calories, including meat, bread, vegetables, milk, and coffee. German Obergefreiter Hans Weber, captured at Kasserine Pass, aged 24, from Bremen, wrote in his contraband diary, "We eat better here than we did in the Wehrmacht, better than my family ate in 1942. This cannot be real." So the dilemma emerged from systemic failure of Nazi ideology to predict American pragmatism. The German military had indoctrinated every soldier to expect subhuman treatment based on racial superiority propaganda. Heinrich Böll, captured in 1945 near Aachen, later recalled, "We were told Americans executed prisoners, that Jews controlled their government and would exact revenge, that we would face torture. Instead, they gave us baseball gloves and asked if we wanted to play." Colonel William Stevens, camp commander at Crossville, 48 years old, West Point class of 1918, veteran of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, implemented detention philosophy rooted in American values of rehabilitation rather than revenge. His office, lit by single hanging bulb, walls covered with maps and Geneva Convention protocols, became decision-making center for unprecedented social experiment. "These men are soldiers, not monsters," he told his staff during weekly briefings. "We treat them according to international law and American principles, period." The statistical magnitude was staggering. Between 1943 and 1946, over 425,000 German prisoners passed through American POW camps. The U.S. Army allocated $27 million annually for camp operations. Prisoner mortality rate remained below 0.15%, compared to 57% for American POWs in Japanese camps, 36% for Soviet POWs in German camps. The numbers told a story of civilization confronting barbarism with systematic humanity. Initial resistance came from predictable sources. American military conservatives who considered decent treatment as coddling the enemy. Civilian populations who lost sons overseas and wanted vengeance. Bureaucrats who saw prisoners as logistical burdens consuming resources. Colonel Stevens faced weekly complaints from Tennessee residents. "Why are they eating steaks while we're rationing butter?" demanded Mrs. Eleanor Bradford, whose son died at Normandy during heated town hall meeting in Crossville, March 1944. The answer required explaining something fundamental about American strategic thinking. The United States was fighting for principles, not just territory. The detention system would demonstrate to prisoners what democracy looked like in practice. It would create living propaganda more powerful than any leaflet. Enemy soldiers who witnessed American values firsthand and returned to Germany carrying that knowledge like contraband. But the implementation faced brutal reality. Language barriers created constant confusion. Medical facilities struggled with tuberculosis outbreaks from prisoners already infected in Europe. Cultural clashes erupted when hardcore Nazi officers attempted to enforce Third Reich discipline inside American wire, intimidating fellow prisoners who showed cooperation. Captain James O'Brien, camp security officer from Boston, Massachusetts, 36 years old, former policeman, documented 17 instances of German prisoners assaulting other Germans for collaboration between January and June 1944. The work program became the revelation that would change everything. Under Geneva Convention provisions, prisoners could be employed for non-military labor with modest compensation. American agricultural crisis made this imperative. 17 million men in uniform meant farms desperate for workers during critical harvests. German POWs found themselves contracted to harvest crops across rural America, earning 80 cents per day, paid in camp currency redeemable for cigarettes, toiletries, candy. Obergefreiter Weber worked cotton fields in Mississippi Delta, September 1944. The heat suffocated, humidity making wool uniforms cling like wet canvas. But American farmers provided water breaks every hour. Farmers' wives brought sandwiches and lemonade at noon. Black sharecroppers worked alongside German prisoners without incident, united by agricultural necessity. Weber wrote, "The farmer's daughter spoke no German, I spoke no English. But she smiled when serving lunch. No hatred. Just humanity. I understood nothing anymore." The first cracks appeared in prisoner psychology when mail from home arrived sporadically, censored but devastating. Letters described Allied bombing campaigns destroying German cities into moonscapes of rubble. Families starving under rationing that made American wartime inconvenience seem like abundance. Gefreiter Klaus Richter, age 21 from Hamburg, received letter from his mother dated August 1943. "The city burns. We eat grass soup. Come home only if you wish to starve with us." He read it in Crossville Camp Library, surrounded by donated books and current magazines, and wept silently. American guards observed transformations occurring prisoner by prisoner. Men arrived hardened by Nazi militarism, convinced of Aryan superiority, loyal to Hitler despite battlefield defeat. They encountered American democracy not as abstract concept, but as daily experience. Camp administration allowed prisoners to elect their own barracks representatives. They organized German-language newspapers, theater performances, educational classes. They received the same medical treatment as American soldiers. They witnessed black MPs, Jewish officers, immigrant soldiers from 50 nationalities, all wearing American uniform, all treated with equal dignity under military code. Lieutenant Hammond initiated re-education program that would become controversial but transformative. German prisoners attended voluntary lectures on American history, democratic governance, constitutional rights. Films showed Nazi concentration camp atrocities as evidence emerged from European liberation. Many prisoners refused to believe, dismissing footage as propaganda. Others sat in stunned silence, confronting truth their government had hidden from them for 12 years. By late 1944, the philosophical crisis intensified. Germany was losing the war. Every prisoner knew it. Radio broadcasts in camp day rooms reported Soviet armies approaching from the east, British-American forces advancing from the west. The homeland they remembered was being obliterated. Colonel Stevens observed increasing anxiety among prisoners during routine inspections. "They're starting to realize," he told his executive officer, "that the Germany they left no longer exists." The decision point approached like freight train nobody could stop. Geneva Convention required prisoner repatriation after hostilities ended. But what if prisoners feared return more than continued detention? What if the enemy soldiers America had treated with unprecedented humanity now viewed the United States as safer than their own devastated homeland? The strategic and moral implications were staggering. Camp Crossville Library, lit by fluorescent tubes, smelling of old paper and floor wax, became philosophical battleground. German prisoners hunched over week-old American newspapers, reading reports of Germany's systematic destruction. Cities they knew as children existed only as names attached to casualty statistics. Hamburg, 42,600 dead, 37,000 wounded, 61% of dwellings destroyed. Dresden, estimates between 22,700 and 25,000 dead in one night. Berlin, 20,000 to 50,000 civilians dead, 7 million displaced, infrastructure obliterated. The chapter closed on a moment of crystallization. May 7th, 1945, WW2 41 hours Central Wartime. Radio broadcast from Eisenhower's headquarters announced German unconditional surrender. In Crossville Barracks, prisoners received the news in stunned silence. No celebration, no despair, just terrible comprehension. Obergefreiter Hans Weber sat on his bunk, wool blanket pulled around thin shoulders, and spoke aloud the question that would define the next 2 years. They will send us back to hell. How do we tell them we would rather stay behind this wire than return to that? The operational reality of prisoner integration into American society began unfolding at 06:30 hours daily, when transport trucks departed camps carrying German POWs to work sites across the United States. The scale defied comprehension. By spring 1945, prisoners worked in 48 states, from sugar beet farms in Montana to lumber camps in Oregon, from canneries in California to cotton fields in Alabama. They operated under oversight, but with freedom that would have been unthinkable in European detention facilities. Technical Sergeant Marcus Thompson, 34 years old, farm cooperative coordinator from Salina, Kansas, managed labor contracts connecting German prisoners with desperate agricultural operations. His office in converted grain warehouse, phone ringing constantly, paperwork stacked 3 feet high, coordinated deployment of 7,200 prisoners across Kansas alone during harvest season 1944. "Farmers don't care they're Germans," Thompson explained to visiting State Department observer. "They care that wheat needs cutting before weather turns, and no American workers are available. War makes strange necessities." The environmental conditions varied wildly by region and season. German prisoners experienced America's geographic vastness in ways few immigrants ever did. Rocky mountain altitude making them gasp during forestry work. Gulf Coast humidity leaving their uniforms drenched by 0800 hours. Great Plains tornadoes sending them scrambling for shelter. Desert Southwest temperatures reaching 112 degrees Fahrenheit. They endured while American civilians endured alongside them. No special protection, no exceptions. The shared hardship created unexpected bonds. Work detail to J.T. Morrison's farm outside Clarksville, Tennessee, June 1944, typified the cultural collision. Morrison, 63 years old, widowed, operating 480-acre tobacco farm with 2 sons fighting overseas, needed 14 workers to save his crop. He received 12 German prisoners under guard of Corporal Eddie Ramirez from El Paso, Texas, 26 years old, Purple Heart recipient, wounded at Salerno. The prisoners arrived expecting slave labor. Morrison handed each man work gloves and thermos of cold water. "You work, you eat," he said through translator. "You work hard, you eat well. Welcome to Tennessee." The challenges multiplied across every operational dimension. Language barriers created constant confusion. German prisoners misunderstanding instructions, American supervisors unable to communicate safety protocols, medical emergencies complicated by vocabulary gaps. Improvised solutions emerged, hand signals, pointing, demonstration by example. Prisoners learned essential English phrases: water, break, doctor, bathroom, thank you. Americans learned basic German commands. Communication developed through necessity, creating linguistic bridges that would last lifetimes. Material shortages affected prisoners just like civilians. Soap rationing meant everyone washed clothes less frequently. Gasoline rationing limited transport, forcing prisoners to walk longer distances to work sites. Coffee rationing, devastating blow to American morale, meant prisoners received the same chicory substitutes that disgusted their guards. The shared deprivation was democratizing in ways policy never could achieve. Prisoners learned that Americans sacrificed voluntarily for war effort rather than being coerced by totalitarian state, a revelation that shook ideological foundations. Critical equipment failures tested American improvisation constantly, harvesting machinery breaking down in fields, forcing mixed teams of prisoners and civilians to repair antique equipment with scavenged parts. Truck breakdowns, stranding work details miles from camp, requiring prisoners and guards to walk back together in darkness, speaking broken English-German hybrids, sharing cigarettes, discovering common humanity on empty rural roads. These moments, unplanned, unscripted, authentic, did more to undermine Nazi propaganda than any official re-education program. The human fatigue factor emerged as central challenge. Prisoners worked 8-hour shifts, maximum 48-hour weeks per Geneva Convention, but harvest emergencies meant voluntary overtime. Prisoners discovered they could earn extra camp currency for additional labor. Many worked until physical exhaustion, driven not by coercion, but by desire to accumulate small luxuries: cigarettes, candy bars, toiletries, stationery for letters home. American materialism, abundance even under wartime rationing, created cognitive dissonance for men raised under Nazi austerity. Gefreiter Klaus Richter worked lumber camp in Millwood, Washington, autumn 1944. The Douglas firs towered 300 feet high, trunks 6 feet diameter, requiring teams of 6 men per tree. American foresters taught German prisoners proper felling techniques, safety protocols, first aid procedures. Richter wrote in Contraband Diary, "They treat us like students, not slaves. They care if we injure ourselves." Today, the foreman stopped work completely when one prisoner cut his hand, bandaged it personally, sent him back to camp in truck. We are the enemy. Why do they care? The organizational chaos stemmed from unprecedented scale and speed. The U.S. Army never intended to manage massive POW workforce. Military police found themselves coordinating agricultural labor contracts, negotiating with civilian employers, resolving disputes between prisoners and farmers, maintaining Geneva Convention compliance while maximizing productivity. Captain Vernon Phillips, 39 years old, Provost Marshal for POW operations in Texas, operated from makeshift headquarters in converted schoolhouse, managing 14,000 prisoners scattered across 117 work sites. "We're making it up as we go," he admitted. "No manual covers this." Civilian-prisoner interactions created the transformation nobody anticipated. German POWs ate Sunday dinner at farm families' tables after morning church services. They played with American children who saw them as exotic curiosities rather than dangerous enemies. They attended barn dances, county fairs, Independence Day celebrations, always under guard, always clearly identified, but increasingly integrated into rural American social fabric. Martha Jensen, schoolteacher in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, wrote in her diary, September 1944, "German prisoners helped repair our school roof damaged by hailstorm. They sang German work songs while hammering. My students watched fascinated. War feels very far away today." The psychological pressure intensified as prisoners processed contradictions between Nazi propaganda and lived American reality. They had been taught Americans were racially inferior, culturally degenerate, militarily weak. They found a nation that outproduced Germany industrially by factors of 10, that treated prisoners better than their own army treated them, that displayed confidence born of strength rather than bluster born of insecurity. Wehrmacht Corporal Friedrich Schneider, captured in Italy, wrote, "Everything we were told was a lie. The factory in Detroit I visited produces more vehicles in 1 month than all German factories combined. And the workers, women, blacks, immigrants, all earning wages we never dreamed of. We cannot win this war. We never could." The camp's social structure evolved into complex microcosm. Hardcore Nazi officers attempted to enforce Third Reich hierarchy, punishing prisoners who showed cooperation with Americans, maintaining Gestapo-style surveillance within camps, threatening retaliation against families back home for disloyalty. Countergroups formed. Younger prisoners, educated prisoners, those disillusioned by battlefield defeats, those grateful for humane treatment. Violent confrontations erupted. American authorities separated the camps. Hardliners isolated in maximum security facilities like Alva, Oklahoma, while compliant prisoners gained increased privileges. Medical treatment crystallized the philosophical divide. German military medicine had been competent but utilitarian. Treat soldiers efficiently to return them to combat. Minimal care for chronic conditions. Psychological trauma ignored. American military hospitals treated German POWs alongside wounded GIs. Same doctors, same medications, same rehabilitation therapy. Prisoners with tuberculosis received months of treatment, including new antibiotic drugs. Those with dental problems received fillings, extractions, dentures. Mental health care was offered without stigma. Obergefreiter Hans Weber underwent surgery for shrapnel wound that German army medics had dismissed as non-life-threatening. American surgeons spent 4 hours reconstructing damaged muscle tissue. "Your war is over," the doctor told him through translator. "You deserve to go home whole." The theme of American pragmatic idealism permeated every interaction. Guards maintained security without cruelty. Administrators enforced rules without sadism. Civilian employers demanded work but provided fair compensation. This wasn't weakness. Prisoners who attempted escape faced swift recapture and punishment. But the baseline assumption was that human dignity mattered even for enemy combatants. Captain James O'Brien explained to new guards during orientation, "These are soldiers, not criminals. We treat them according to military code and Geneva Convention. Anyone who abuses a prisoner answers to me and court-martial. America doesn't win by becoming what we're fighting against." Letters from home grew increasingly desperate. By autumn 1944, German postal system was collapsing under Allied bombing. Mail took months to arrived damaged, arrived with entire paragraphs censored. The content was apocalyptic. Families homeless after bombing raids, living in rubble, begging for food, describing neighborhood children dying of malnutrition. Prisoners read these letters in camp day rooms while surrounded by abundance. Their own plates full, bodies healthy, and the guilt became crushing weight. They were safer, better fed, and more secure than their own families. The moral inversion was unbearable. Work became psychological escape. Prisoners volunteered for extra shifts, requested harder assignments, pushed themselves to exhaustion. The labor provided distraction from guilt and anxiety. It also provided dignity, earning wages, learning skills, contributing productively rather than rotting in idleness. American employers noticed. Recommendations circulated. This prisoner was exceptionally skilled carpenter, that one had agricultural expertise, another showed mechanical aptitude. Informal employment networks formed. Farmers asked if specific prisoners could return next season. The relationships transcended wartime categories. The adaptation accelerated when prisoners witnessed American democratic participation during 1944 presidential election. Campaign posters appeared in towns near camps. Americans debated politics openly, criticized their own government without fear, voted freely in November. German prisoners observed electoral process as anthropological phenomenon. They had known only dictatorship masquerading as democracy, where elections meant rubber-stamping predetermined results. Watching Americans peacefully transfer power, debate policy, tolerate dissent, this was revelation more powerful than any propaganda. Democracy wasn't abstract philosophy. It was lived reality that Americans practiced unconsciously, like breathing. By early 1945, transformation was evident statistically. Escape attempts declined 73% compared to 1943. Disciplinary incidents decreased by 58%. Voluntary participation in educational programs increased 340%. Productivity rates in work programs exceeded projections by 22%. More tellingly, informal surveys showed 64% of German prisoners viewed America more favorably than before capture, 71% expressed desire to emigrate after war, 43% stated they feared returning to Germany. The numbers quantified a psychological revolution. The chapter concluded with a moment that captured the impossible paradox. March 15, 1945, Camp Crossville Recreation Hall. Prisoners organized concert featuring German classical music, performed by captured Wehrmacht musicians. American guards, officers, and civilian employees attended as invited guests. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Ode to Joy, filled the wooden hall, played by enemies for captors who had become something else entirely. Respectful adversaries, reluctant friends, witnesses to each other's humanity. In the audience, Colonel Stevens observed tears streaming down prisoners' faces. They weren't crying for Germany. They were crying because they finally understood what had been stolen from them, the freedom to be human without ideology dictating every thought. And they understood that returning to Germany meant leaving this behind, perhaps forever. The first intelligence reports arrived through official military channels in April 1945, but German prisoners learned the horrifying truth through informal networks. Letters smuggled past censors, Red Cross workers whispering during camp visits, German-language broadcasts monitored secretly. The Reich they had fought for was not merely defeated, it was annihilated, partitioned, occupied by forces whose approaches to reconstruction varied from rehabilitation to revenge. Captain Daniel Morrison, Intelligence Liaison Officer, 31 years old, University of Chicago graduate in European history, stationed at Fort Sam Houston, coordinating POW information operations, compiled classified briefing documents that painted apocalyptic picture. Soviet occupation zone in eastern Germany. Summary executions of suspected Nazi collaborators, mass deportations to Siberian labor camps, systematic dismantling of industrial infrastructure as war reparations, reports of widespread sexual violence against German women, British and American zones in Western Germany, relative restraint but still devastation, cities reduced to rubble, millions homeless, food rations at 1,200 calories daily, typhus and tuberculosis epidemics, economic collapse. The classified assessment concluded, Germany as functioning nation-state has ceased to exist. The cognitive impact on prisoners manifested in measurable behavioral changes. Camp psychiatrists noted dramatic increase in anxiety disorders, insomnia, depression, and panic attacks among prisoners facing repatriation. Dr. Eleanor Hartman, civilian psychiatrist, contracted by U.S. Army, 43 years old, Vienna-educated refugee who fled Austria in 1938, conducted clinical interviews at Camp Crossville. They present classic symptoms of anticipatory trauma, she reported to Colonel Stevens. These men fear returning more than they feared combat. They describe nightmares of arriving in Germany to find nothing but ruins and corpses. Several have requested to remain in detention indefinitely rather than face repatriation. The strategic confusion among German prisoners centered on fundamental question: which occupation zone? Soviet sector meant almost certain death or decades in Gulag labor camps. British sector offered marginally better survival odds, but still meant returning to bombed wasteland. American sector represented relatively best option, but capacity was limited and assignments were essentially random based on prisoners' documented home region. Prisoners from Eastern Germany, Silesia, Pomerania, East Prussia, faced mathematical certainty of Soviet control. Their terror was absolute. Reports from repatriated prisoners who had returned earlier provided devastating first-hand accounts. These letters, smuggled back to camps through complex networks, circulated like contraband samizdat documents. They described arriving in Germany to find hometowns literally erased from maps, families dispersed as refugees, Soviet NKVD arresting returning POWs on suspicion of treason for having surrendered. One letter from repatriated prisoner in Leipzig, forwarded secretly to Camp Crossville, described arriving home. My street no longer exists. 1,400 people lived in my neighborhood. I found 37 survivors living in cellars. My wife and children are gone. Nobody knows where. I wish the Americans had kept me. German military personnel in American custody observed this growing panic with professional assessment. Oberst Heinrich Müller, Wehrmacht colonel, captured in France, highest-ranking officer at Camp Crossville, age 47, career military from Prussian tradition, conducted informal polling among prisoners under his informal authority. His findings, documented in diary, later seized by American intelligence. 83% fear Soviet capture more than remaining in American detention. 67% would volunteer for labor battalions under American supervision rather than return to Soviet zone. 41% have stated willingness to renounce German citizenship if emigration were possible. Morale is not low, it is non-existent. The perception gap between American authorities and German prisoners was profound. U.S. military policymakers, operating from Washington bureaucracy, viewed repatriation as straightforward legal obligation under international conventions and political necessity to demonstrate good faith to allies. They understood Germany was devastated, but assumed prisoners would naturally want to participate in national reconstruction. They fundamentally misunderstood depth of prisoner terror about conditions awaiting them, particularly regarding Soviet occupation. Intelligence officers who had actually served in European theater understood better. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, 42 years old, OSS liaison, who witnessed Soviet operations during link-up at Elbe River, submitted minority report to Pentagon. Soviet treatment of German prisoners and civilians constitutes systematic brutality without precedent in American experience. Returning prisoners to Soviet custody may satisfy legal obligations, but violates moral principles we claim to defend. We are delivering men to probable death or slavery, while calling it liberation. The documented evidence accumulated from multiple intelligence sources. Red Cross investigators reported Soviet POW camps holding German prisoners in conditions violating every Geneva Convention provision. Starvation rations causing mass death, no medical care, forced labor in mines and construction projects in Siberian climate without adequate clothing, systematic torture of suspected SS members. Mortality estimates for German POWs in Soviet custody ranged from 35% to 43%, over 1 million deaths out of approximately 3 million captured. By comparison, German POW mortality in American and British custody remained below 1%. German prisoners who had fought on Eastern Front provided first-hand testimony that corroborated intelligence assessments. Gefreiter Otto Kruger, aged 23, from Dresden, captured at Normandy after being transferred from Eastern Front, described to camp translator, "I saw what Soviets do. We found German prisoners recaptured by Red Army. They were nailed to barn doors, eyes gouged out, genitals severed, left to die slowly. This was their message. Surrender means death worse than combat. Now we are going back to them. How do you expect us to feel?" The ideological confrontation within camps intensified as repatriation approached. Hardcore Nazi officers who had maintained Third Reich discipline now reversed position. They advocated refusing repatriation, claiming loyalty to Germany meant not returning to Soviet occupation. Former dissidents who had cooperated with Americans and accepted re-education argued for returning to help rebuild democratic Germany under Western occupation. The debate raged in barracks at night, sometimes erupting into violence. American guards separated antagonists but couldn't resolve philosophical crisis. What did duty to homeland mean when homeland no longer existed as they had known it? The first official repatriation convoys departed American camps in July 1945. German prisoners boarded transport ships at Norfolk, Boston, Charleston, reverse journey of their original arrival. The emotional scenes were documented by Army Signal Corps photographers. Prisoners weeping openly, some refusing to board requiring physical restraint, others boarding with resignation of condemned men approaching gallows. U.S. Army chaplains reported prisoners requesting final religious services as if preparing for death. Captain William Brooks, transport officer supervising embarkation, reported to superiors, "These men are more terrified leaving American custody than they were entering it. I've never witnessed anything like this." Letters arrived from repatriated prisoners confirming worst fears. Censorship had collapsed in immediate post-war chaos, allowing unfiltered accounts to reach prisoners still in American camps. The testimonies were apocalyptic, arriving in Soviet zone to immediate arrest and transfer to labor camps, being forced to clear minefields without equipment as punishment, summary executions of anyone suspected of ideological unreliability, systematic confiscation of any possessions, separation from families, deportation to industrial sites in Ural Mountains. One letter smuggled to Camp Crossville stated simply, "Do not return if you have any choice. What awaits here is slower death than combat, but equally certain." The desperation manifested in increasingly bold actions. Prisoners began approaching American officers, requesting to remain in detention indefinitely, offering to work without compensation, volunteering for any service that would prevent repatriation. Obergefreiter Hans Weber submitted formal petition to Colonel Stevens. "I request political asylum in United States. I renounce allegiance to German state that no longer exists. I offer skilled labor, loyalty to American Constitution, gratitude for humane treatment. My home city is now Soviet occupation zone. Returning means imprisonment or death. I beg you for mercy of allowing me to remain in country that treated me better than my own ever did." American legal framework provided no mechanism for asylum requests from enemy combatants. International law and bilateral agreements with Allied powers required repatriation. State Department policy prohibited naturalizing former enemy soldiers. Immigration quotas were already overwhelmed by displaced persons from across Europe. Individual sympathies among American personnel couldn't override policy established at highest government levels to maintain Allied unity. Requests were denied with official regret and personal anguish. The psychological deterioration among prisoners awaiting repatriation became medical crisis. Camp infirmaries reported dramatic increases in suicide attempts, self-harm incidents, psychosomatic illnesses, complete emotional breakdowns. Dr. Hartman's clinical assessment warned, "We are inflicting psychological trauma equivalent to combat stress by forcing repatriation to conditions prisoners rationally fear as life-threatening. Many exhibit symptoms consistent with being sent to execution. From psychiatric perspective, we are causing harm to populations we have otherwise treated with exemplary care." Small numbers found illegal alternatives. Prisoners who had worked on farms established relationships with American families willing to hide them after repatriation orders. Estimates suggest between 2,000 and 5,000 German POWs remained in United States illegally after official repatriation program ended. They assumed false identities, worked under the table, lived in constant fear of discovery and deportation. Yet they chose this risk over certainty of Soviet occupation. Their desperate calculation spoke volumes about comparative terror. Illegal immigrant status in America was preferable to legal citizen status in Soviet-controlled Germany. The final irony emerged from comparing prisoner treatment during detention versus during repatriation. America had spent enormous resources maintaining humane conditions, implementing educational programs, facilitating work opportunities, ensuring medical care, all according to Geneva Convention and American values. Then that same humane system delivered prisoners to Soviet custody, knowing full well what awaited them. The moral contradiction was inescapable. America's adherence to international law meant violating the humanitarian principles that had governed prisoner treatment for 3 years. The chapter concluded with scene that crystallized the tragedy. September 12, 1945, Camp Crossville, final transport convoy preparing to depart. Gefreiter Klaus Richter, who had worked American lumber camps and written extensively about transformation from Nazi believer to democratic convert, stood in formation wearing German uniform, preparing to board truck, bound for ship, bound for Soviet-occupied Hamburg. Colonel Stevens approached for final inspection. Richter stood at attention, tears streaming down face, and spoke in carefully practiced English. "Sir, I thank you for showing me what civilization means. I thought Germany was civilization. I was wrong. I am returning to place that is no longer my home, controlled by people who hate me, to future without hope. I wanted you to know, America won this war not with bombs but with humanity. I will never forget. Neither will thousands like me. You taught us something Hitler never could, that strength and mercy are not opposites." He saluted. Colonel Stevens returned salute, turned away, and wept. The statistical accounting of German POW repatriation from American custody concluded in late 1946 with bureaucratic finality. 372,041 prisoners returned to Germany, 23 died in American custody from natural causes or accidents, 2,127 remained classified as administratively delayed for various reasons, and an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 disappeared into American society illegally. Behind these numbers lived individual stories of divergent fates that would define post-war German-American relations for 70 years. The immediate impact of prisoner return to Germany was documented through Allied Occupation Authority reports and German civilian testimonies. Prisoners arriving in American occupation zone, southern and western Germany, found relative order. Military administration functioning, food distribution organized, reconstruction beginning, democracy being methodically rebuilt under Marshall Plan framework. Prisoners arriving in Soviet zone, Eastern Germany and territories ceded to Poland, found hell that confirmed every fear. NKVD secret police operating openly, arbitrary arrests continuing years after war ended, industrial equipment dismantled and shipped to Soviet Union as reparations, forced collectivization, destroying agricultural productivity, living standards falling to subsistence levels. The occupation zones became parallel universes, separated by barbed wire and ideology. The testimonial evidence accumulated from survivors who eventually escaped Soviet zone and reached Western Germany. Their accounts, collected by refugee assistance organizations and intelligence services, described systematic persecution of returning POWs under Stalin's paranoid logic that any Soviet or German soldier who surrendered rather than fighting to death was ideological traitor. German prisoners returning to Soviet zone faced immediate interrogation about whether they had been corrupted by Western democratic ideas, whether they had collaborated with American captors, whether they could be trusted as loyal subjects of Soviet satellite state being constructed. Many were arrested and sentenced to additional years in Soviet labor camps despite having committed no crime beyond surviving American detention. Friedrich Schneider, the Wehrmacht corporal who had documented America's industrial superiority, returned to Leipzig in American sector occupation zone, September 1945. His family home was rubble. His parents were dead in Allied bombing. His younger brother had died on Eastern Front. His sister was refugee somewhere in Western Germany. He found work as translator for American military administration, leveraging English learned in camp. His diary entries from 1946 through 1950, later published as Between Two Worlds, provided eyewitness account of German transformation. We are being rebuilt physically by Marshall Plan, but more importantly, we are being rebuilt philosophically. American officers who could be dictators instead enforced democracy. They require Germans to confront atrocities we committed. They don't allow us to claim innocence, but they also offer redemption through reconstruction. This is the greatest gift, the possibility of becoming something different than we were. Otto Kruger, who had feared Soviet retaliation after witnessing Eastern Front atrocities, was assigned to Soviet occupation zone based on his documented Dresden residence. He was arrested within 48 hours of arrival, interrogated for 2 weeks about his time in American custody, accused of being American spy, and sentenced to 8 years labor camp in Siberian copper mines. He survived through combination of luck and desperate resilience, was released in 1953, escaped to West Berlin through tunnel network, and immigrated to United States in 1958 under displaced persons provisions. He lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, working as machinist until his death in 1997. His oral history, recorded for Holocaust Memorial Museum archives, stated, "America saved my life twice. First in 1944 when they captured me instead of Soviets. Second in 1958 when they allowed me to immigrate. I pledged allegiance to American flag with emotion no native-born citizen could understand. This country is what Germany could have been if we had made different choices." Hans Weber, who had begged for asylum and been denied, returned to Bremen in British occupation zone, October 1945. He found his family intact but living in cellar of destroyed apartment building. His father had been mid-level Nazi party official, not criminal by Allied classification, but sufficient for dismissal from civil service. The family was destitute. Weber used skills learned in American agricultural work programs to secure employment with British military farm rehabilitation project. He never forgave British administration for forced repatriation, despite relatively humane treatment in their zone. In 1952, he immigrated legally to Canada, settled in Ontario, and operated dairy farm for 40 years. He named his farm Crossville, after the Tennessee camp, where he had learned American agricultural methods. His children asked about the name. He explained once, never spoke of it again, but kept photograph of Camp Crossville in his study until death in 1989. Klaus Richter faced the worst fate. Assigned to Soviet sector despite family originally from Hamburg, he was arrested at reception camp, transported to Labor Battalion clearing unexploded ordnance in former East Prussia, and killed when mine detonated in June 1946. His death was recorded in Soviet military records discovered in Russian archives in 1993. No notification was ever sent to his family. His mother searched for him until her death in 1967, never knowing his fate. The file contained single personal item, waterlogged diary, with final entry dated the day before his death. The entry, in German translated by archivists, read, "I dream every night of Tennessee, the mountains, the farm families who fed us Sunday dinner, the American colonel who treated us like soldiers instead of animals. I thought I understood what we lost in war. I was wrong. We lost the chance to become what America showed us we could be. Instead, we are becoming what Stalin wants, slaves with German faces. If I survive this, I will find way to America. I will live free or die trying. Tomorrow we clear minefield. I am not optimistic." The broader consequences rippled through West German society for decades. The estimated 200,000 former POWs who had been held in American camps became influential advocates for German-American reconciliation, democratic reformation, and Atlanticism versus Soviet communism. They formed veterans organizations dedicated not to glorifying Wehrmacht, but to promoting transatlantic understanding. They became politicians, educators, businessmen who maintained emotional connections to America based on lived experience of humane treatment during captivity. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, architect of West German recovery, specifically recruited former POWs from American camps for diplomatic and cultural exchange programs, recognizing their unique perspective. The comparative analysis between American and Soviet detention systems became Cold War propaganda both sides exploited. United States showcased German POW treatment as evidence of democratic values producing superior outcomes even for enemies. Soviet Union dismissed accounts of harsh treatment as capitalist fabrication, while simultaneously using stories of American coddling of German prisoners to argue Americans had been insufficiently anti-fascist. The truth, documented through international observers and survivor testimonies, was incontrovertible. German prisoners in American custody survived at rates exceeding 99%. Those in Soviet custody died in numbers approaching 40%. The moral calculus was undeniable. The immigration question haunted American policymakers for years. Thousands of former German POWs applied for U.S. immigration visas throughout late 1940s and 1950s under various Displaced Persons Acts. Many applications were approved, particularly for prisoners who had worked on American farms and established sponsorship from former employers. These immigrants became American citizens, raised American families, contributed to post-war prosperity, and carried with them complex identities. German-born, American-made, forged in crucible of war and detention. They were living embodiments of redemption through humane treatment. The rediscovery of the story occurred gradually through academic research and documentary investigation beginning in the 1980s. Historians examining wartime records discovered the vast scope of German POW presence in United States. Fact known to Americans living near camps but largely forgotten in national narrative, dominated by combat stories. Oral history projects recorded elderly German-American immigrants describing their wartime experiences as prisoners. Their accounts contradicted prevailing assumptions. They didn't describe horror of captivity, but rather described transformative experience of encountering American values through institutional practice rather than propaganda. Arnold Kramer's 1979 book, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, brought scholarly attention to previously neglected topic. Subsequent research uncovered extensive documentation, camp newspapers published by prisoners, educational program curricula, work detail contracts, medical records showing quality of care, and most powerfully, letters and diaries from prisoners expressing shock at humane treatment. The historical consensus emerged. American detention of German POWs represented unprecedented humanitarian success. demonstrating that even amid total war, adherence to civilizational values could produce outcomes superior to barbarism in both moral and practical terms. The philosophical implications challenged comfortable narratives on all sides. For Americans, the story complicated triumphalist war narratives by showing that significant victory was won not through combat, but through living up to stated values when treating defeated enemies. For Germans, the story forced confrontation with reality that Allied powers, particularly America, had offered redemption, while Soviet power had offered only continued suffering. For international law scholars, the story provided case study proving Geneva Conventions produced tangible benefits when enforced properly. For Cold War historians, the story illustrated how ideological competition was won through actions demonstrating systemic superiority rather than through propaganda claiming it. The human reconciliation occurred in thousands of private interactions decades after war ended. German immigrants returning to hometowns they hadn't seen in 50 years, bringing American spouses and children. American farmers traveling to Germany to visit former prisoner workers who had maintained correspondence across decades. Camp guards and former prisoners reuniting at anniversary commemorations, embracing as old men, sharing memories without animosity. These moments, undocumented except in family albums, untheorized except in personal testimonies, constituted the real victory over fascism, the restoration of human connection that ideology had attempted to sever. The final accounting extends beyond statistics to meaning. American detention of German POWs during World War II demonstrated several fundamental truths: that treating enemies humanely doesn't constitute weakness, but rather demonstrates civilizational confidence, that adherence to legal and moral frameworks produces strategic advantages beyond immediate military necessity, that individuals can be transformed through positive institutional experience even after indoctrination by totalitarian ideology, and that small acts of humanity multiplied across hundreds of thousands of interactions can shift historical trajectories more effectively than grand gestures. The legacy endures in modern German-American relations. The Federal Republic of Germany developed as strong democratic ally of United States, anchored in NATO, committed to liberal democratic values, economically integrated with Western markets. This outcome wasn't inevitable. It required deliberate effort by both nations. But foundation was established during war through decisions to treat defeated enemies according to civilized principles rather than descending to their methods. The former POWs, who became advocates for German-American friendship, the American Guards, who demonstrated that mercy and strength coexist, the policymakers who insisted on Geneva Convention compliance despite political pressure. Their collective actions wrote a chapter in history proving that humanity survives even total war when people choose to embody their highest values rather than sink to circumstances. The story concluded not with war's end, but with immigrants' naturalization ceremony, courthouse in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, April 1959. Otto Kruger, age 38, survivor of American detention and Soviet labor camp, raised his right hand and swore oath of allegiance to Constitution of United States of America. The federal judge, World War II veteran who had fought in Germany, shook his hand and welcomed him as fellow citizen. Kruger wept, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude that after experiencing humanity's worst and best, he had finally reached a place where the best had prevailed. He carried that oath in wallet until death. On back, in German, he had written, "Ich bin endlich zu Hause." I am finally home. If this story moved you, showing how humanity can triumph even in the darkest hours of history, please hit that subscribe button and join our community dedicated to uncovering the untold stories of World War II. These accounts matter. They remind us that even in total war, the choices we make about how we treat each other define who we become. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. Did this story change your perspective on the war? Do you have family stories about POWs or the home front? Let's keep this important conversation alive. And if you found value in this deep dive into history, share it with someone who appreciates real stories about real people facing impossible choices. Together, we're preserving memories that deserve never to be forgotten. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to learn from it.